Now is it? Whoa. Woo. Is that loud?
No, it's okay. It's good. Just talk normal voice.
Just talk normal voice. I have a strident normal voice. I'm usually at a half screech. Okay. Welcome to the 2017 Honey Haber Memorial Lecture. Honey was a faculty member in the philosophy department at UC Denver. After her untimely death, her parents, Charlie and Millicent, endowed our library and this lecture. Thanks to their donation to the Philosophy Club, in particular Andrew Kane, as well as to the philosophy department's program assistant, Liz Puente Calderon, who's taking pictures, and Andres, who is videoing, as we have a lovely setup and a good crowd today. Our featured speaker this year is Peg O'Connor, professor of philosophy and gender, women, and sexuality studies, and chair of the philosophy department at Gustavus Adolphus College. Her areas of specialization include Wittgenstein's approach to social theory, ethics, metaethics, and the philosophy of addiction. That's not Wittgenstein, that's just Peg. She has published books on each of these topics and others. She speaks powerfully, for example, of how oppression in the forms of racism, sexism, and heterosexism gets its meaning from the context of our social practices and institutions. In her most recent book, which I recommend to a broad audience interested both in philosophy and in addiction, it is entitled Life on the Rocks, Finding Meaning and Addiction in Recovery. In addition to the books, Professor O'Connor also co-maintains the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's feminism entry and contributes to the New York Times Opinionator as well as to the Stone, and she has her own blog on Psychology Today titled Philosophy Stirred, Not Shaken. This last addresses a wide variety of ordinary topics connected with addiction, but in a philosophically informed way. Today she'll be focusing on epistemic authority and addiction treatment. Her paper's entitled Addicts, Stories, and Knowledge, Epistemic Authority and Effective Treatment. Please help me welcome Peg O'Connor.
Well, thanks for that lovely introduction, Candace. Made me sound a lot better than I am. My name is Peg, and that's usually how I introduce myself. And just to be clear, the pronoun I'll use in this paper when talking about addicts is we or us. I am myself an alcoholic, not drinking for a good long time, so that's a good thing. And I'm also a philosopher, and for decades, I kept these two parts of me separate, but brought them together, I think, in a way that makes good on a promise that a lot of us philosophers have, namely that philosophy ought to be useful. And talking about addiction using philosophy is one way that philosophy has been incredibly useful to me personally, and it has been very useful, I think, to people struggling with addiction and the people who work with us. So I'm just thrilled to be here under the auspices of the Honey Haber Lecture, and I hope that I don't disappoint. And if I do, let me know. And just off to say, if you're not a philosopher, the word epistemic is a bit of a fancy pants word that really just means knowledge related. It's about knowledge and usually connected to authority. So who gets to be an authority about knowledges, including self-knowledge? So I just want to put that caveat out there. William James, in his great work, The Varieties of Religious Experience, had an enormous influence in addiction treatment. In 1934, Bill Wilson was at the Charles B. Town Hospital in New York City trying to sober up yet again. Full of despair and hopelessness, he cried out, quote, "If there is a God, let him show himself. Let him show himself. I am ready to do anything, anything," end quote. Suddenly the room was filled with a white light, and he felt what he described as a spirit blowing across him. And at that point he realized he was a free man. Very soon after this experience, not surprisingly, he thought he was losing his mind. A friend came to see him, Eddie Thatcher, and his friend brought the book The Varieties of Religious Experience with him as a way for Bill Wilson to understand this remarkable experience. And in that book, Varieties of Religious Experience, which I'll just call Varieties because otherwise we'll all be tripping over that, Varieties, James was most concerned with people who had experienced what he called a conversion or a rebirth or a regeneration or a rejuvenation. He uses those words interchangeably. These are people for whom religion exists, quote, not as a dull habit, but as an acute fever. Bill Wilson seemed to have caught that fever. He later went on to found Alcoholics Anonymous. In Varieties, Bill Wilson found a treasure trove of first-person stories that resonated with his own experiences as a hopeless and incurable alcoholic. Am I bobbing and weaving up here so I'm going in and out? I do that. Sometimes when I'm teaching, I just start dancing in the middle of class. I think people are falling asleep, so I start breakdancing, or you think, oh, Michael Jackson's here. Means someone's asleep. So several of the conversion experiences that James highlights and returns to throughout the Varieties involved reformed drunkards or inebriates, to use the language of his time. And these experiences were all respectfully and compassionately treated by James, which is not surprising for several reasons. Perhaps most relevant was that James had the intimate knowledge of the ravages of drunkenness. His own younger brother, Robertson, who went by Bob, had several stints in asylums for the inebriate and spent his last living days with William James and his wife, Alice. As a philosopher, as a physician, and a psychologist before that discipline even was formally recognized, James was and remains a valuable and insightful companion to addicts and those who work professionally with us. James's work is especially relevant today with increasing rates of addiction to increasingly dangerous substances, often accompanied by mental disorders requiring more nuanced treatment options and treatment plans. And William James was an astute student of human nature and human suffering, in large part because he observed and listened to people. He sought out their stories. James is the quintessential seeker. That is one way to understand him. First-person narratives or stories are the primary source of evidence for spiritual matters, these religious conversions, that James marshals in Varieties. This talk today will explore three dimensions of these first-person stories and how they are important for the recovery of individuals, just as Bill Wilson discovered for himself, and for the field of addiction and treatment research, especially as it becomes more medicalized. So as neuroscience and medical science become the dominant players in defining and therefore then treating addiction. The first intriguing strand in James's treatment of first-person stories is that he lets people speak for themselves, and by doing so accords them a great deal of epistemic authority. He accords them enormous authority to report on the meaning of their experiences. He does not position himself as a third party playing the role of experts on their experiences and the meanings that they were able to make of them. The inebriates, people who are so often judged to be among the most unreliable and to be morally suspect, are taken by James to be reliable witnesses to and interpreters of their own experiences. These experiences of these inebriates, of these drunkards, are side by side with the experiences of saints and literary giants and intellectuals such as Tolstoy, Thoreau, John Stuart Mill, and religious leaders such as George Fox and Jonathan Edwards. And James later revealed in correspondence with a friend that he included his own experience of what he described as a deep pathological melancholia in the Varieties. So James is right in this book. And someone once said, you tear a page of William James's, if you were to tear a page of William James's writing, it will bleed. That's how much he is in his work. So it is important to see this approach as recognizing the epistemic authority of inebriates, as democratizing epistemic authority. So to use an expression from William James in an essay entitled The Will to Believe, when we respect each other's mental freedoms, which includes the ability to tell one's own story, we create what he calls an intellectual republic. And that is a lovely phrase that I don't want to lose in treatment and recovery program. So this is what James creates in the varieties. He creates an intellectual republic within the varieties, and it is something that needs to be carried forward. The second intriguing dimension of first-person stories is the way that James underscores the social nature of self-knowledge. Reading these accounts in the varieties, Bill Wilson saw himself quite clearly. He saw his own experiences, all the pain, the suffering, the self-loathing, the attempts, and the failures to stop, and the despair, reflected back to him in a way that enabled him to make sense of what had happened to him, what he'd done to himself, and, quite importantly, how he might live differently. So his imagination got stoked. And the role of imagination in recovery, I think, is incredibly important and largely ignored. That's a topic for another day. So Bill Wilson adopted many of the concepts that James advances in the varieties. He adopted them and he tweaked them and maybe didn't get them quite right. But some of the crucial components or crucial concepts he have: conversion, misery threshold. There's no talk of rock bottom. William James talks about a misery threshold. Higher and friendly power. Friendly is really important there. In conjunction with a variety of other concepts. So many people say the 9th step promises you can see in James when he talks about having a whole raft of obstructions and ways of thinking kind of broken like bubbles. They just dissipate in a kind of way. So Bill W. latched onto this book, and if you were to study the 12 steps, you'd see a fairly significant degree of incorporation, but not quite getting William James right. So that's a separate project to try to take James out and argue for more Jamesian understanding of what addiction and recovery might look like, maybe another time. So many of us share our stories of addiction both as a way to help ourselves maintain our sobriety and to help others achieve sobriety. Many feel as if we have a responsibility to share our stories and to listen to others. The way one tells her story and how others hear it matter enormously. This leads to the third interesting dimension of first-person stories. Almost without fail, especially with the reformed drunkards, an attitude of humility runs throughout the story. There is a very interesting relationship between humility as an epistemic virtue and the possibility for self-knowledge and the achievement of sobriety that these narratives reveal. Humility in telling must be met with humility in listening. James himself embodies that humility in varieties, and so provides a very good model for physicians, researchers, and treatment professionals working with people struggling with addictions. So the three features of the varieties: epistemic authority democratized through first-person stories, self-knowledge as social, and humility as an epistemic virtue are all crucial for understanding addiction and possibilities for recovery. I will focus primarily on humility, but those two other strands will emerge, although not as full-blown as one might hope. And I'll end this talk today with a concern about the decentering of addicts' stories and our self-knowledge, and the concentration of epistemic authority in the hands of physicians and insurance companies that together pose a very serious challenge to the very possibility of an intellectual republic of addiction and treatment programs. A lack of humility on that level runs the risk of creating conditions where it will be much more difficult for individuals to recover. Humility as an epistemic virtue. There's a gap in the humility lecture on the relationship between humility and self-knowledge. And just as an aside, in certain strands of traditional epistemology, so the area of philosophy concerned with knowledge, self-knowledge is kind of regarded as suspect. It's regarded as if it really belongs on the island of misfit toys, to make an important, highly literate reference to Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. Those are the toys on the island that aren't quite right. So there was the Charlie in the box instead of the Jack in the box. There was the train with the square wheels. Was there an elephant that swam, that had flippers? And then there was Dolly. Everyone remember Dolly? No one ever knew what was wrong with Dolly until one day on Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me, the creator of Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, said that maybe Dolly had psychological problems. So self-knowledge is on the island of misfit toys for philosophers. So treatments of humility most often conceive it as a relational virtue that is primarily concerned with attitude towards my own and towards others' achievements and accomplishments. The achievements and accomplishments generally include expertise, awards, career success, material wealth. Neither humility itself, nor self-knowledge, nor sobriety are seen as achievements and accomplishments. I claim that humility is itself an achievement and is in fact a necessary condition for self-knowledge in relation to one's addiction. And a lack of humility limits, if not precludes, self-knowledge, which will make it far more difficult for a person to achieve any kind of sobriety. So humility as a virtue is a mean between two extremes of vanity and abasement. So if you've studied any Aristotle, that's a virtue is a mean. It isn't exactly in the middle. There are some ways in which you have to take circumstance and other considerations into figuring out what would be the appropriate way to respond. So it's the mean between two extremes, and the two extremes are vanity, which is the deficiency, not having enough humility, and self-abasement, having way too much humility. So much of the humility literature focuses only on the vanity end of the spectrum, and it's important to focus there. One of the more highly regarded treatments of vanity is in Roberts and Wood, and they primarily define humility in the negative. It's the absence of vanity and arrogance, so it's defined in a negative. Vanity, on their view, is a concern of a person to make a good appearance, to look really good. They say solely, I say primarily, for the positive social status that it confers. We all want to look good in the eyes of our peers. Arrogance is a more illicit entitlement claim based on one's alleged superiority. Entitlement is crucial. An arrogant person may feel justified not to see others as knowledgeable, and hence disregard anything that they might see. And arrogant people tend to think that others cannot know as much, or what they know is mostly inconsequential. Arrogance and vanity are inseparable. They tend to feed off one another. More difficult to identify than overt arrogance, and I think most of us know arrogance when we see it, and if we're not arrogant people, we tend to pull back from it. But more difficult to identify than overt arrogance are instances where one person's dismissal of another's knowledge or interpretation of his own experiences spring from good intentions and or a belief that one knows what's in the best interest of the other. This is covert arrogance or arrogance in drag. Whether this belief comes from academic or professional training, life experiences, or something else, the result is the same. The one does not regard the other as an equal who may possess knowledge, insight, or valuable experience. Humility, on Roberts and Woods' view, involves avoiding an overestimation of yourself and your accomplishments. Additionally, humility is a lack of concern or inattentiveness to how other regards you and your accomplishments and how you regard yourself. Now, there's something right about avoiding overestimation, people who get too big for their britches. There's something totally right about that. But this is where a lot of the humility literature tends to stop. What's going on the other end of the spectrum with self-abasement? And I think people who struggle with addiction might be a little more familiar with that end of the spectrum than they are with the vanity end. So humility must also avoid the underestimation of oneself. So at that far end of the spectrum is self-abasement, which, as I said, is on beyond low self-esteem. Self-abasement tends to be a set of beliefs and attitudes that one has no worth, and that perhaps even one is repulsive in some sense. One is just an abject failure. So having no worth, a person deserves nothing good and has nothing positive to contribute, she might believe. And a person who suffers from self-abasement may believe that, yeah, I know everything about myself, and all of it is really bad or dirty or rotten or shameful or some other really kind of loaded moral language there. So we need a better account of humility, one that takes what is right about the negative, but has to have something positive there to fend off the extension of that spectrum down to the self-abasement way. So J.L. Garcia offers a more robust definition of humility, again, saying that humility is a mean between those two extremes, and that will complement good recovery. So someone, and this is up on the board here, someone is humble about her being F, and F is just having certain talents or skills or achievements. If and only if, so you logicians, you studying logic, it's a biconditional, if and only if. She downplays being or having those talents, that F stands for all of that. She doesn't stress in her own self-identity, her liberties, her privileges. Hey, look how great I am. Doesn't dismiss the talents and achievements of others. I don't need to build myself up by tearing you down. Recognizes how others have helped her to have F, those talents, those gifts, those achievements, those accomplishments. Commits to her moral improvement. Recognizes her own shortcomings. Did that make it up there?
Yeah.
Okay. And 7, recognizes her duties and obligations to others. And as a moral philosopher, I love the last 4. So Garcia concludes that we can say of the person who meets all 7 of these conditions, and, logicians, they constitute one big honking conjunction, that she is unimpressed with herself. So conditions 1 through 3 align well with that overestimation characterization offered by Roberts and Wood. Vain and arrogant people tend to stress their own achievements and tend not to recognize the talent and experience and knowledge of others. People who do not meet the first 3, I believe, will have a much harder time meeting the 4 positive ones, which will guard against the person progressing too far down that self-abasement end of the spectrum. To recognize others have helped you is to implicitly recognize that someone sees something worthwhile in you, even as you yourself might struggle to do so. Moving away from self-abasement, in my opinion, is a form of moral improvement in the most basic sense of recognizing your humanity and maybe even discovering a shred of dignity. And to recognize something as a shortcoming, as opposed to an abject failure or utter perversion, is a form of moral progress. Shortcomings can be transformed into strengths. The 2 extremes, vanity and self-abasement, get in the way of overcoming addiction in different but complementary ways. Self-abasement breeds a kind of self-deception that in its worst form becomes a form of fatalism. Why even bother to try to sober up someone like me? I'm just going to fail. I'm the kind of person, I can't do this. I'm too weak. I'm too damaged. I'm too flawed. Why bother? I might as well just give up. Overt and covert vanity pose different problems. So if I am rather vain, and maybe people are pointing out, you know, Peg, you're kind of drinking a lot, or you're using more than other people. If I have a certain kind of vanity, I might say, well, someone like me couldn't have a problem. I'm too smart to be an addict, or I'm too healthy, or I come from a family of alcoholics. I know better. Vanity is going to get in the way there. Vanity can also prompt a professional working with us to minimize or disregard what a person struggling with addiction has to say. And this brings me right back to varieties. James's treatment of first-person stories of addicts' struggles is instructive for avoiding both extremes that we see here. So meet the drunkards of varieties. And if you've never had the opportunity to read the varieties of religious experience, and you want to dedicate a good portion of your life to do so, because it's about 600 or 700 pages, it's chock-a-block with fascinating stories. James was utterly fascinated, in particular with saints who would go through all these self-mortification rituals and would do these wild and crazy things, and they burned with that acute fever. But it is so instructive too as an insight into human nature. And so if you do have the opportunity, it's really worth it. I guarantee you will be just captivated by it. And he originally delivered what became the Varieties in a series of lectures over 2 years. And the Varieties is really interesting because he pulled together resources that had Buddhist roots, that had Muslim roots, that had various denominations of Christian roots, pagan roots. He was working on this in 1898. He was not Googling. He was not Googling. This was not ready at hand. And it's interesting to note that he did a lot of the reading for material that went into this book in the 1870s when he was struggling with that pathological melancholia that he later writes about in these lectures. So it's stunning what he was able to put together. And he wanted to have so many different spiritual, and really we should say spiritual instead of religious. He's not interested in institutions of religion. It's that deep spiritual one-on-one relationship to a higher and friendly power or to God. He's clear, he says, what we Christians call God, but it's far more ecumenical than that. So meet these drunkards and hear about some of their stories. So the first-person stories and Varieties, especially the ones related to drunkenness, embody Garcia's dimensions of humility. These stories are powerfully evocative because of the despair, the loneliness, and the hopelessness they convey. And James offers two particularly compelling cases that he returns to throughout. So the first is a Christian evangelist named Henri Aline, who struggled with drinking and what he called carnal mirth. So for the younger people in the room, if you don't know what carnal mirth means, the guy was thinking about sex a lot and having a lot of sex. Let's put it that way. Aline kept making promises to himself not to engage in these activities. But as familiar to many of us addicts, he broke those promises when tempted by wine, music, and the company of friends. Full of self-loathing, he became, in his own words, wild and rude. After the debauchery, he describes himself, quote, as guilty as ever. I was one of the most unhappy creatures on earth, end quote. And this is when he was the life of the party, right in the middle of everything. He was the catalyst. He was, like the baseball player Reggie Jackson described himself in 1978, after the hideous Yankees won the World Series, as the straw that stirred the drink. That was Aline. He got everybody going. So the second story James offers is S.H. Hadley, who described himself, quote, a homeless, friendless, dying drunkard. Hadley describes the night that he's sitting in a Harlem saloon, shaking with the DTs and feeling utterly broken and penniless. He writes, quote, as I sat there thinking, I seemed to feel some great and mighty presence. I did not know then what it was. I did learn afterwards that it was Jesus, the sinner's friend. I walked up to the bar and pounded it with my fist till I made the glass rattle. Those who stood by drinking looked on with scornful curiosity. I said I'd never take another drink. If I died on the street, really, I felt as though that would happen before morning. Something said, if you want to keep that promise, go and have yourself locked up. I went to the nearest station house and had myself locked up. Once he's released from his cell, he returns to his brother's home and then visits a mission where, quote, the apostle to the drunkard and the outcast, that man of God, Jerry McAuley, was praying. Hadley listened to the testimony of 25 other drunkards who had given up the rum. That was one of the expressions there, given up the rum. And as he was listening, he recalls, quote, I felt I was a free man. From that moment till now, I have never wanted a drink of whiskey, end quote. Hadley's soul was no longer riven by the inner conflict over his drinking. For this reason, James describes Hadley as an example of a divided self or a sick soul. Those are some of the terms he used, becoming unified. Hadley's story, as is Aline's, is one of deep despair and desperation. There's no bragging about past drinking exploits, but rather there is a frankness and honesty about his past failures and his transgressions. Any self-deception about his drinking and its effects on him and others had been long stripped away. He knew himself to be completely miserable. So long as he lied to himself or otherwise deceived himself, nothing was going to change. Both Hadley and Aline are brutally honest. There are no attempts to gloss over their past action. There's no braggadocio. Their behavior was, to them, a source of great shame and regret. Both Aline and Hadley find what James calls their misery thresholds. This concept is an excellent way to understand the depth and degree of emotional suffering that a person can tolerate. Each person's misery threshold is subjective and unique to him. Each person must find that threshold for himself, but that does not entail that he must find it alone. Knowing how much suffering a person can take and tolerate is a very hard-won form of self-knowledge that is critical for people struggling with addiction and trying to live in recovery. It is also critical knowledge for professionals to recognize in the creation of treatment plans. Returning to the last four of Garcia's criteria for humility, Hadley recognizes the help he had from the jailer who locked him up, the brother who took him in, and that apostle of the drunkard, Jerry Macaulay, along with the 25 men whose stories he heard. By seeing himself in their stories, he started to identify his own shortcomings, and perhaps most importantly, he saw a different way to live. He saw that there were different possibilities, different actualities. By not drinking and helping others in the same way that he himself had been helped, Hadley made a commitment to his moral improvement by recognizing and acting on an obligation to help others who were just like him. So by the time he read the stories and varieties, Bill Wilson had already been stripped of his self-deception, and his arrogance and vanity were long since gone. He saw himself in these stories, sure. The particulars were different, but the trajectory was largely the same. And this provided him with great insight into what he needed to do differently if he truly wanted to stay sober. One was that he could not do it alone. The self-knowledge that Aline, Hadley, and Wilson came to possess is deeply social and acquired in the company of others. And just as important, their self-knowledge is not just a cognitive state involving propositions. So if you had your epistemology class, S knows that P. It's not that. It's rather a matter of action in how one shows up in the world. Self-knowledge is ultimately practical. It is not theoretical. It is not just seen in what we say and believe, but rather in what we do. Final section, Assault on an Intellectual Republic of Recovery. The field of addiction treatment most assuredly does not function as an epistemic democracy or an intellectual republic. That's not a news flash. So this brings me to my final Jamesian consideration about first-person narratives and addiction. It is fair to say, as a medical doctor, so James trained as a medical doctor, he studied with German psychologists, and he studied philosophy and had his academic appointment in a philosophy department for most of his professional life, all the while creating what in the US has become psychology. Given all that together, it is fair to say that he would have the highest respect for the potential contributions that the sciences could make to the treatment of addiction and to understanding the causes of addiction. But it is just as fair to say that James had an equal or greater concern about the expansion of positivist science, what he called medical materialism, into all realms of human living. So these days we talk about biological reductionism. James's term is medical materialism. James was worried that the materialist, physicalist, reductionist explanations would bring along a brand or form of determinism. So as he writes in his essay, The Dilemma of Determinism, what does determinism profess? It professes that those parts of the universe already laid down absolutely appoint and decree what the other parts shall be. The future has no ambiguous possibilities hidden in its womb. The whole is in each and every part, and welds it with the rest into an absolute unity, an iron block, in which there can be no equivocation or shadow of turning. Determinism would call free will into doubt and fly in the face of human freedom, which is the gravest concern for James. Determinism may breed a sense of fatalism. Why bother to resist something that far outstrips an individual's ability to control, and in some sense is inevitable? This is why it's appropriate to revisit these warnings now in the context of addiction and recovery. Addiction studies has been undergoing a seismic shift, with neuroscience beginning to overtake the field and trump all other forms of knowledge. The view is that our brains, our pleasure circuitry, is the organ working in overdrive. The language of dependency and addiction is changing to reflect the new scientific advanced claim that addiction is a chronic brain disease. That is the official position of the National Institute of Drug Abuse, which is part of the US government. So the US government is saying that addiction is defined as a chronic brain disease. The strongest version of this view may imply the only acceptable treatment for patients will be of the pharmacological sort. Even more worrisome is the fact that in the United States, the National Institute of Mental Health now requires that clinical researchers focus on neural circuits or biomarkers. As a consequence, only certain treatment modalities based on a physicalist or this medical materialist account will have the opportunity to be, I hate this expression, evidence-based, let me get my bunny scare quotes going here, and eligible for insurance coverage. There's legitimate concern that pharmacology is triumphing, and we can talk about the way that pharmacology has driven this opioid epidemic and the heroin epidemic. Maybe for questions. So as a psychiatrist, Bessel van der Kolk notes about the category of mental disorders, quote, the brain disease model takes control over people's fates out of their own hands and puts doctors and insurance companies in charge of fixing their problems, end quote. The shifting of the terrain in addiction studies poses a significant risk to a balance of epistemic authority. Medical authority will always both claim and be accorded greater epistemic standing, thereby increasing the likelihood of epistemic injustice. Epistemic injustice, as philosopher Miranda Fricker defines it, is of two sorts. This is also up here. The first is testimonial injustice, which she describes as a prejudice in the economy of credibility. Some people, because of their race, their class, their sex, or some other group membership, such as drug user, are taken as unreliable, as not credible, or not truthful. The lack of reliability may extend to nearly everything else, especially to their own experiences. Those whose identities involve the intersection of multiple suspect groups, addict, poor, non-white, female, disabled, will be subject to far greater testimonial injustice than others. In other words, the stories of addicts will be distrusted and discounted. The second sort of epistemic injustice is hermeneutical injustice, which exists at a structural level when a community lacks the appropriate conceptual framework to interpret certain experiences or to provide the context for meaning and sense. One obvious example of hermeneutical injustice is the lack of understanding many people had about women's experiences in the workforce that we now, thanks to many feminist frameworks, identify as sexual harassment. And you can go back to the Clarence Thomas confirmation hearings, and that really took that notion of sexual harassment and put it up there for public discussion in a kind of way. It created a framework for many women to understand what their bosses was doing to them wasn't okay, that it wasn't just part of the price of doing business, but it was sexual harassment. That power to name is crucial. So with respect to addiction, in a very short amount of time, the brain disease model has become dominant and has displaced other models. With the language of brains being hijacked or commandeered, or my favorite was brains going rogue. I mean, it sounded like Star Wars 12, brains going rogue. It offers a picture of how addictions progress physiologically in all addicts. Sameness of physiological progression becomes the expectation and the norm. There's little room left to discuss differences in specificity. One of the consequences of the brain disease model is that addicted brains, rather than people living with addictions, becomes the focus of research. Addicted persons become objectified and become a type, an addict. And as a feminist, there's great work to be done on the objectification. You know, feminists have been so good talking about sexual objectification. Addicts are being objectified as having this deviant, rogue, hijacked brain. So hermeneutical injustice creates stereotypes and warped images of groups of people that are then more easily seen, recognized, and taken as true than actual patients sitting before them in an office. We know stereotypes better than we know actual people. Along with the stereotypes come all sorts of judgments and questions. If a person is not willing to use medication-assisted treatment, will he be judged to be not trying hard enough or not taking his sobriety seriously? If a person wants medication-assisted treatment, will he be accused of drug seeking? Yes. Those who have privileged positions within the dominant framework will be accorded more epistemic authority. They will have a credibility excess. They will have the institutional power to make diagnoses and then decide what counts as an effective or appropriate course of action. To be very clear, I'm not dismissing the importance of recent developments in neuroscience and advances we have made in medication-assisted treatment, nor am I imputing bad motives to scientists, physicians, and treatment professionals working in the field. To the contrary, the vast majority of people working in that field have the best of intentions. However, those intentions can provide cover for what I called that arrogance in drag, or that covert arrogance that will affect how good a treatment plan can be created and executed. So I am deeply concerned about the epistemic injustices that are often connected to social, political, economic, racial injustices that create the conditions where some people will have a much harder time getting sober in the very context that should give them the best chances. To see the importance of first-person narrative, self-knowledge, and humility of both people struggling with addiction and those who work with us, consider someone addicted to heroin. And I was looking at the addiction numbers in Colorado. So the number of overall deaths from overdoses has gone down. That's good. And there was the biggest decrease happened with the prescription painkillers. However, there's been a sharp uptick in death by overdoses from heroin, and cocaine is back in the mix. Actually, there was a 50%, it increased by 100%. I think it went from 50 to 96 for cocaine overdoses in this past year, and I think heroin overdoses went up. I scribbled the number down somewhere. I can't say it. Went from 160 to 197 deaths. So good news, overall numbers are down, and they think that has to do with physicians getting a little better about the number of prescriptions they're writing, but in 2012 there were 259 million prescriptions written for painkillers. That's gone down some. So the hypothesis says physicians are getting a little better, but then people are being driven to heroin because it's cheaper and fairly easy to get. And Candace was telling me, because you've got highways that run north and south, east and west. Did I do that the right way? Let's say I did. You're in a crucible here for that. So the importance of medication-assisted treatment in Colorado, in Denver, where I live in Minnesota, it's a rural area, there's a lot of heroin, there's a lot of meth. Medication-assisted treatment is going to become more important. So where do these first-person stories fit in? So let's imagine a heroin addict has the good fortune to have access to a physician who's authorized to treat opioid addiction with medications. Imagine this person has been free from heroin and other opioid drugs for at least 7 days. A physician may offer Vivitrol, which is injectable naltrexone given monthly to help reduce cravings. The cravings are both physical, the body wants what the body wants and what it's become accustomed to, and psychological, the mind wants relief or pleasure. Vivitrol, this is how it works, it blocks the euphoria of heroin, so that totally blissed out, everything just kind of melts away from you. So it blocks the euphoria of heroin, but it does not block the other effects of heroin on the body's respiratory and cardiac systems. So when someone has a heroin overdose, oftentimes they either go into cardiac arrest or they stop breathing, or both. The assumption guiding the use of Vivitrol is that without the high, cravings will subside and so too will use. The fact that Vivitrol is effective for a month relieves a person of having to make a daily decision about taking this prescription medication and gives him time to work on treatment, counseling, and other activities related to sobriety. So Vivitrol offers great promise, and many people have used it to very good effect. It's not intended as a long-term maintenance drug such as Suboxone or Methadone. Now here comes the rub. For Vivitrol to be effective and not life-threatening, it must be administered only under certain conditions, and these warrant serious consideration. The medication guide explicitly states the risk of opioid overdose is quite high if a person is taking Vivitrol and then uses opioid drugs. Because Vivitrol blocks the euphoria, a person may try to shoot through those blocking effects. And additionally, Vivitrol, its effectiveness decreases as the month goes on. So if someone has been taking Vivitrol and they're at the end of their 30-day cycle, the cravings may come back, they might think about using. But many people who have been on Vivitrol, who then go back to heroin, shoot up the same amounts they were prior to taking Vivitrol, and their body can't tolerate it in the same kind of way. So this patient faces a profound existential question. Should he risk, or should he try to save his life by risking his life? How is he to decide what to do? How is a course of treatment offered and then chosen? So imagine that person is much like Henri Alline, whom James introduced in the Varieties, who described himself, quote, "In a storm, yet I continued to be the chief contriver and ringleader of the frolics for many months, though it was a total toil and torment to attend them." Alline clearly recognized the pull of his friends, that when he got with his friends, he just gave himself over to that. And not only was he vulnerable to the allure of parties, he was the main instigator, all the while being tormented by his own actions. He knew this about himself. That's a crucial piece of self-knowledge that should function with a treatment professional trying to figure out if Vivitrol might be a viable option for you. So, self-knowledge is more than sharing a timeline of using history. It's hearing the reasons why a person used and understanding the meaning he made of his use and the progression to full-blown addiction. It's hearing about how a drug made a person feel. It's about hearing the physical, social, and economic environments in which to use and the environments in which he will try to be sober. Knowing how and why a person came to treatment is one way to come to understand an addict's misery threshold. And knowing a person's treatment goals matter enormously as well. One needs to know the person and not just the medical condition. Now, someone like S.H. Hadley, he was the one who had himself locked up, might realize that effective treatment for him requires being locked up in some way or in a very rigid structure, such as an inpatient treatment program or intense outpatient treatment program. He might realize that he needs a very high degree of supervision and accountability that a very good drug court can provide. And in a drug court setting, participants often form bonds with other participants and also with the drug court team, comprising judges, probation officers, therapists, police officers, physicians, employers. Making connections, fostering relationships, helping others to get and stay sober, making different and better life choices are all ways that people embody those final 4 criteria of Garcia. Recognizing how others have helped, committing to moral improvement, recognizing shortcomings, and meeting obligation to self and others. Effective treatment requires a great deal of time and dedication on the parts of both patients and professionals. In the United States, it is not possible for the majority of people who need treatment, especially those with opioid dependence, to get it. The number of physicians who are certified to provide medication-assisted treatment is stunningly low compared to the number of people seeking help. The number of healthcare claims for people with opioid addiction increased 3,000% between 2007 and 2014. 3,000% in a 7-year window. Recent changes to the controlled substances, what is it? It's comprehensive addiction recovery, pick a letter A, CARA, has increased the number of medication-assisted patients a physician may see from 100 to 275 patients, but this still falls far short of need. In theory, best practices, another phrase that drives me mad, for medication-assisted treatment resist the pull of that medical materialism and reductionism by recommending a combination of medication, counseling, and behavioral therapy. The reality is skyrocketing demand, time constraints, and insurance coverage complexities make it far more difficult to implement best practices for effective treatment. While it is true that there are commonalities to addiction's trajectories, each person is unique, as is the development and progression of his addiction. This is precisely why first-person stories must infuse any treatment program, but especially medically assisted treatment. Conclusion. William James provides anyone interested in addiction with powerful stories and conceptual resources. He embodies epistemic virtues that lead to better knowing, and he would acknowledge better ways of living. He said, "You always judge the goodness, the value of something by the fruits it bears." There is an important role for James in contemporary discussions of addiction. Adopting a much more thoroughgoing Jamesian approach provides a powerful counterbalance to the scientization of addiction research and treatment. The more these questions are scientized and brought under an umbrella of scientific expertise, the more epistemic injustice may thrive. James invites and authorizes his readers to embrace their own epistemic authority with a deep and abiding humility. It's an invitation we ought all to accept. Thank you.
We have time for some questions.
Turn on Mr. Microphone here.
There you go. See if it works. One thing's turning it on. Hello. Liz.
No, it's working.
No, I think I heard it. Do it again.
Feeling.
Yeah.
I saw a hand all the way in the back.
You said this might be, I'll just project.
Stand up to project really loud because some people may be hard to hear.
You said this might be a better topic for a different day, but what do you think is the role of imagination in addiction treatment? That was such an interesting statement.
I think moral imagination is crucial, and that we suffer from a scarcity of it. And I think when people are really addicted, they've got good imagination that only runs in one direction. And that's always to the worst case scenario, or how they're going to screw up, or how they did screw up, or everything that's wrong with them. It's really quite difficult when someone who's gone so far down that spectrum to self-abasement to be able to see possibilities that, no, this isn't inevitable. My life doesn't have to be like this. I'm not this terribly damaged, destroyed person, but maybe I can see myself in different ways. And it's really interesting. William James, in a footnote, the truth is always in the footnotes. Didn't a very famous philosopher of science say that, Lacatoche? The truth is always in the footnotes. And in one footnote, James references the founder of the Salvation Army. And the Salvation Army is problematic in all different kinds of ways. We can talk about that. But one of the things that the founder of the Salvation Army said, General Booth, was sometimes someone can be helped just by recognizing that someone else takes an interest in whether they sink or swim. Because some people, if they're so far down that spectrum, are truly indifferent to whether they live or die. They just don't care. It doesn't, who's gonna miss me when I'm gone? But if someone else takes an interest in you, even just a small interest, that may help you to take an interest for yourself. And if you can begin to see the world differently, if you in some ways can kind of water ski behind that person pulling you along by having interest in you until you can get some momentum by yourself, you have to be able to imagine you and the world being different. And when you can't do that, I think it's next to impossible to be sober or to change your relationship to alcohol and drugs. Does that answer?
Yes.
I don't know if this is a question or a comment, because I'm a sociologist, I don't know any better. So I take your first invitation to first-person narratives very seriously. I'm a qualitative sociologist. Then I'm thinking about medicalization, I'm thinking about, now I learned that it's actually, how it's related to hermeneutical injustice. So I'm thinking about like applied issues such as DSM-2, early 1970s, homosexuality, taking out, even though it took actually like all the way to 1985 or so to be really effective, unlike what people think, or post-traumatic stress syndrome being introduced, or ADHD being introduced.
Right.
So there are the first person narratives, and there's the community that sort of takes them and collects them and makes it into their business to kind of, I look at psychiatrists these days sort of like, and then pharmaceutical companies behind them, and I make my students watch the talk on the National Institute of Mental Health's brain disease model, and I'm going, how can we incorporate, again, this is not necessarily, but the first person narratives into community action to actually do something with it, to bring the stories of the deviant or outsiders back where they belong.
That's definitely attention. So one of the things that I think is fascinating about Alcoholics Anonymous is that there are no official leaders, there are no official connections. There's a World Service Organization, but it's kind of meant for accounting and stuff like that. It has escaped the long arm of study by sociologists and psychologists, in part because of the anonymity, and that's the way that it should be. One of the things I like about self-help groups, and Alcoholics Anonymous is one of them, and not the only one, Lifeline, Rational Recovery, that it's in telling those stories, in having a space where I can say something and people are gonna nod along with me. There's something so validating when I don't feel like the freak anymore, or when I realize other people get me in a kind of way. And that seems really visceral. Because a lot of people, when you read addiction memoirs, if you yourself are an addict, you tend to think, I'm the only one like this. I'm the only one who can be this bad, or I'm the only one. AA has an expression for that called terminal uniqueness. But when you get in a room with other people and they're telling their stories, they may not be identical to you, but you see yourself in them. And so the philosopher Wittgenstein has this wonderful concept of family resemblance. Addicts don't share one thing in common, but there are overlapping similarities between all of them that are like a family. So when you look at a portrait of a family, it isn't that there's one trait that everyone in that family has, but you can look at all of them and say, oh yeah, grandfather's eyes, mother's features. And that's, I think, a better way to understand sort of what addicts have in common and what addictions have in common. But that just gut relief of feeling like somebody gets me. But the hard part is then moving that, if you are needing to engage in treatment and intersect with the insurance industry, that whole thing of what's going to count as the best practice, what is evidence-based. You can have all these first-person stories in the world saying, hey, this works, and it's not going to matter. So I'm really worried about what's happening. And I'm worried about the pharmacology in all of this, that is trumping every way to understand addiction. When I look at myself, I don't see an addicted brain. I see an addicted person living in the world. And that's what we're dealing with. But it's that medical materialism. Just we can figure out what's going on in that neural circuitry with you. We think your dopamine levels just off a little bit. No, that isn't all that it is. It may be some of it. It may be an important part of it. But an addiction isn't all in your brain. And if you doubt that, and you don't know how it's a full person, look at the symptoms of withdrawal. And you will see how bodily it is, how the guts are involved. And why do we just study the brain? It's all these different things.
So a couple of comments. First of all, I very much appreciate the framework of epistemic injustice, and especially hermeneutical injustice. I really would love to pinch and zoom that, publish that very widely, because I think there's in my experience as a therapist who's worked with families with addiction, there's a great deal of systemic myopia. There's, just like you said, that there's a lot of this biological reductionism, and that there's no, there's not a ton of curiosity about whether your dopamine levels are off. Could it be because you live in a system that is oppressing you?
Yeah, oppression happens.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think there really needs to be a lot more understanding about how systems play into the things that we're finding biologically. So just I wanted to really affirm that. And the other thing I wanted to look at a little bit is that the vanity to self-abasement scale there, and I just relate it to what I've seen in the recovery literature about the notion of shame. And I think that actually ties back to hermeneutical injustice, just because I think, what plays into that a lot of my experience is that people's sense of self is how they relate to others in their families and their communities, right? And so sometimes a person's vanity is like a compensation for being oppressed by everyone else.
Yep.
You know what I mean? And so healing becomes partly becoming into a community, into a supportive community, which is one of the things that's quite helpful, I think, about AA and other recovery communities.
Yeah. I think it's right. In the humility lecture, there's this one philosopher, Julia Driver, who argues that in some ways a person ought to be ignorant of one's achievements and accomplishments. And I think that's exactly the wrong thing to be when your achievement is being sober, when it is not using or behaving in certain ways. And the whole thing of being not impressed with your achievements, the part of the paper that I cut out has to do with what ought to be the relationship one has to her sobriety. I'm not impressed with myself. And maybe it's still holding on to residual shame of, well, how did I get to be that bad that, my addiction was out of control? No, it's got more to do with, I like the verb to cherish. And I think I cherish my sobriety in part by having that kind of humility that my sobriety isn't all my great achievement all by myself. There are other people who help me all the way in very different kinds of ways. That when I recognize that, I cherish what it is that they give me and what I crave for myself. I mean, bottom line is, I make the choice not to drink every day. I do make that choice. Go ahead. But I know that surrounding myself with the right people makes it much easier for me to make that choice. And when I start to struggle, and I did start to struggle, a few years ago, and, I had people I could call. I had books I could read. I had colleagues I could consult. And I'm not impressed, but I cherish it because I know what might happen if I go back drinking the same way. It's something like Pascal's wager. It's rational for me to believe that I'm an alcoholic, and if I get going again, it's going to be really bad. Versus, you know, if it turns out I drink again and I can drink like a normal person, I don't feel like I've really lost anything by maintaining I'm an alcoholic, I don't drink, and I'm choosing not to drink. And so that to me is about cherishing. I'm not impressed with it in that kind of vain way, but I'm cherishing it, recognizing how others have helped me, which is, you know, part of that, how others help me to stay sober. And, you know, my moral improvement. If I do get a little big for my britches or I start to take it for granted, I need somebody to bring me back down to size. Rumor has it I do have some shortcomings. We'll leave those aside for now. And I really do see myself as having a duty and an obligation to help others. I work with the students who engage in high-risk drug behavior at my college. I do work like this. I see it as an obligation, but I also see it as an amazing privilege and a calling in some sense, in the good old-fashioned, non-religious sense of vocation. I've got a skill set, I've got some experiences. You all come out on a beautiful sunny afternoon. Can't be better. I saw someone over here in the back.
So I'd like to hear your thoughts on the idea of like the double bind for an addict of if I admit that I'm an addict, I have the social stigma, but then also people don't want to help people because they are addicts.
So the double bind is the catch-22, the damned if you do, damned if you don't, at least caught between a rock and a hard place, or sometimes it's a quadruple bind, rock, hard place, cesspool, and swamp. Talked about that in one of my classes the other day. It's like, oh, forget double bind, we got the quadruple bind. So the double bind is there's a stigma that attaches to identifying as an addict, and the other side is that
Like, you know, for my own family, say, some family doesn't want to help other aunts because they have a problem, so they're just going to keep doing the problem. So it's almost like we don't want to help because we know it's just going to fail. So you're restricting help.
I think the fatalism that an addict has steeps is what a tea bag does, right? Steeps out into whole families. And so if you are in a family dynamic where there is one addict, you all are on that roller coaster. And that's another really great reason to read William James. In particular, read his letters to his brother Henry. So Henry, the great novelist, who got away from the whole family and went to live in England his entire adult life. If you read the letters back and forth between Henry and William, when discussion of Bob comes up, they're on the roller coaster. Sometimes William James will write everything. One expression was tip-top with Bob. And then a letter not that long after was, I wish he would die to save us all this future heartache. So, I mean, riding that, right? So, I mean, that whole thing that families get caught too, and we do enormous damage to families. So, if I have been a supportive family member and you have gone through treatment and I've done everything that I think I should do, and yet you keep relapsing, you can see why some people want to give up. But then too, when you sort of claim either an identity as an addict or struggling with an addiction, you kind of stand out from your family in a different kind of way. So you're kind of a pariah in different ways. So that's the double bind you're getting at, right? So yeah, how do you navigate that? And I think that's a great question for the therapist to answer. I'm just a philosopher. I only identify these things. I know nothing.
I'm very interested in your idea that only within a sort of ways of living can things like oppressions of racism, sexism, those sorts of things arise. But also, I know from my own research that only within certain kinds of cultures and ways of living do we have addicts. So I wonder, what have you been thinking about that?
Yeah, is the addict a type of person that didn't exist before? It's a category. Same way homosexualism is a category. So I think Foucault, I haven't read a lot of Foucault since I got out of grad school, so somebody who knows more Foucault than I do, correct me if I am wrong. But one of the things that they talk about is the way that types of persons were created, and sort of the notion of the lunatic or the madman was created. And then we had to come up with different kinds of institutions for dealing with them at the same time we're creating them. So as we deal with them, we create them. As we deal with them, we create them. So Candace, I hear you asking, are we doing something similar like that with this category of addict? Would it be anachronistic to say, well, there have been other cultures where lots of people are drinking lots of things, and you think about it, it's kind of weird. Fermentation is kind of a weird process. There are things that mystify me in life. You know, there's some grapes that taste a little funny. I eat a bunch of them. I get this crazy buzz. Who decided eating mold was a good idea? We have cheese. Right? So human beings do all of these kinds of things. And I'm really struggling with this question. So I wrote this short little piece, is everyone addicted to something? No. So in my other life, I work on the philosopher Wittgenstein. So I think a lot about language, and I think a lot about concepts and terms, where they have their life. How far can you stretch a term to have it, how far can you stretch a term and it still retains its meaning, versus if you stretch it too far, if everything counts as an addiction, nothing is an addiction. And I think it's really interesting as we're having these battles, particularly with the DSM. We've had to go to Arabic because we don't use Roman numerals anymore, and it's too bad. In the category pending future study has to do with internet, or, you know, they don't say social media, but is that. Many people have been arguing for hypersexuality or sex addiction. I always want to say sex addiction, and that's not right. Come on, we all have these little moral slips or verbal slips. And what's at issue in something getting the kind of imprimatur, this is a real addiction? Because as Andrew pointed out, there's a stigma that attaches to it. I mean, I certainly didn't want to have an addiction or identify as an addict. It's like, well, what kind of cultural capital is that going to get me? That's not going to help me. I was never out about any of this in any job applications, and it was only after I was a full professor that I started writing this crazy stuff. Like, can't touch me. MC Hammer. But the way the word addiction is getting used now has a certain kind of elasticity that bugs the living daylights out of me. I don't know what I think about shopping addiction. Survey says, is shopping a behavioral or process addiction? First reaction. Hands up, it's an addiction. Okay, what makes it an addiction? So I will say, I was a conference chair for this conference that Candace came all the way to my school and I never met her. But it was this conference trying to figure out what's addiction. And we had some top-notch addiction researchers who just fought like crazy. Is it a bunch of compulsions? Is it all in the brain? Is it a learned behavior? Is it all these things? So when you start to interrogate, well, what's an addiction? They could not agree on anything. So is it surprising that we can't agree on what counts as good treatment? No. But I'm curious, so those who think that shopping is an addiction, what makes it so? Why?
The compulsive nature of it, along with the self-gratification and the self-satisfaction after some people, you know, I've witnessed after people shop, they'll get that calm feeling. Yeah, they'll have the drop and feel fine.
So people use drugs that they want to use or behaviors because they're looking for certain effects. So you're saying it's a self-soothing one, relief.
Yeah, I just had a friend like half hour ago tell me she was stressed out, so she went and shopped, and now she's good to go.
And there was a joking expression, wasn't it shopping therapy or something like that? Retail therapy. So the DSM-5 for substance use disorders have 11 criteria that divide up into 4 categories. And those 4 categories are, I'm going backwards, pharmacological indicators, risky use, controlled impairment, and social impairment. I got 4. Shopping, how would you fill in those criteria?
So like what they say about drinking.
It's not how much you drink or how often, but how it affects your life.
Okay.
Pharmacologically, what if there's an adrenaline, a buzz you're given when you score a good deal?
So you get the 70% off the lowest price. Right? I mean, it's the thrill of the search, and then you got it. Yeah, I mean, some are saying by including gambling was the first behavior that made the leap into the addiction category. Before it had been regarded as a compulsive behavior. And some are saying you open up that door to behavioral or process addictions, and you're going to let everything in, everything that people just can't control. But where's that line between what I can't control, but it's still not an addiction? And believe me, I don't think you can answer this because those experts weren't answering, and they just started swearing at each other. I'm not going to do here.
This to me is like, so then what is normal? How do you create this metric thing? I'm sorry.
Okay, yeah, so what is normal? So here's one of the things that I have found. People who wonder if their drinking is normal are actually wondering if they have a problem. And if you wonder if you have a problem, you're paying attention to something, and something is giving you the message, something's going off here. But what I think is also true is that, so this goes back to the environmental considerations, we tend to want, one of the ways that we talk about what happens with social impairment. So the DSM-5 criteria asks for you to look at your behaviors, the consequences of behavior, over a 12-month period. So it isn't just kind of episodic, but 12 months is a good long time. Patterns develop pretty quickly. And one of the things that happens is that your social life might dramatically change. You might start to orient your activities around people who drink in the ways that you want to drink, or stay away from the people who drink, who don't drink like you want to drink. Get mad if, no, there's no alcohol, or no, we're not going out tonight, no, we're going to stay home. So if your sort of social life is changing because of the use of a substance or behavior, and if sort of social conception of selves are right, I mean, we do fundamentally change who we are as we become addicted. And then that comes back to that self-knowledge piece. I mean, how do you come to know yourself when you are so difficult? When you are so, well, you're difficult too when you're an addict. Oh, that's another stuff. When you are so different from how you knew yourself. So sort of how I got into looking at addiction from a philosophical viewpoint was she's still alive, thankfully. I have a good friend who sobered up, and she was newly sober, and she said to me, I feel like a completely different person now from when I was drinking. And that whole question about the continuity of self, how am I the same person here right now on April 13th at 4:50 something Mountain Time? How am I the same person right here, right now, as I was 15 years ago, and as I might be? And so, you know, that self-knowledge piece, no amount of introspection is going to tell me that. It's only going to be by standing in relation to others, including some others that I may have to cast off to the side. So when they talk about, you know, what's the most dangerous time for someone coming out of treatment? It's right when they get out and they go back into those exact same environments. Surprise. I have a friend who got out of detox, went into treatment, got out of treatment, shot up within 20 minutes with two people who had gotten out half an hour earlier. So in half an hour, they scored. So, you know, if who I am is both what I do and with whom I do it and with whom I relate, that gets back to that William James piece, that self-knowledge is so deeply social. But if I don't take that seriously, and many addicts tend to isolate, and then you're always going to have confirmation bias. Everything about me is going to be proof positive that I'm a degenerate, that I'm a loser, that I'm so flawed I'm not worth anything. So that's, yeah, well, I'm going to come back to my sobriety, not my great achievement. It's got to do doing things like this.
So one of the questions then is, how do you resolve testimonial injustice and self-delusion? Someone is saying, oh, no, I don't have a problem, while they're shooting up, and 20 minutes later, how do you help them?
Yeah, and that's really hard. And self-deception is another one of those philosophical categories on the island of misfit toys. And self-deception fascinates me because I think people are self-deceived all the time about whether or not they do have a problem or not. And they're self-deceived about a whole variety of things. So yeah, if my statements are all this way and all my friends around me are saying something different, no. It's also about trust, and that's a piece I didn't talk about here, that trust is an incredibly important epistemic virtue. And it turns out we trust all sorts of things. We trust textbooks, we trust our teachers. In general, children trust their parents, and all of this. But self-deception and lack of trust, I think, oftentimes go hand in hand. And I think in some ways, it is a kind of leap. And I think in part, maybe that goes back to that General Booth comment, that I may not be able to see the decency in myself, and I think I'm the worst thing in the world, but if someone else shows me a little bit of compassion, and then I can show someone else compassion. I mean, I think it is that kind of hitchhiking. But it's very much of a ongoing struggle, I think, because both of these forms of injustice are internalized. And so how do you, I mean, this is a great question in feminist philosophy, how do you root out the oppressor within? And sort of what counts as credible witnesses against everything that you've internalized in this worldview about people like you? Yeah, I think that's exactly the question.
I'm sorry to tell you, we're about out of time. There's still plenty of food over here, and Peg has not left the building. So if you would help me to thank our guests, we can talk her after.